If you scare easily, swipe on. In 1989, a woman started hearing strange banging sounds in her walls and in the ceiling, and then one night, the crawl space to her attic was open, so she went to go have a look. When she's just feet away, an old man suddenly appears in the crawl space and looks her dead in the eye before vanishing. There was nobody else in the house. Worried no one's going to take her seriously over an apparent ghost in her house, she ends up calling a paranormal investigator. When the paranormal crew arrived, they were actually very skeptical until they heard loud banging in the attic and they decided to go up and have a look. As soon as the two men get up into the attic, one of them screams and suddenly disappears. The other, who didn't have a flashlight, starts using the flash on his camera to illuminate the attic. And he takes one of the most famous pictures in paranormal history. His partner, who was in total shock, had been lifted off the ground and tied to one of the beams. That was the last night the woman ever stayed in the house. However, it's still being rented out today, but nobody stays longer than 1 or 2 months. I used some of the original footage, so please be advised. In the early 2000s, a video was discovered inside one of the scariest places on Earth. It's called the Catacombs, and it's one of the world's largest mass graves. To get to it, you need to wriggle through these claustrophobia-inducing tunnels hundreds of feet below the city of Paris. The video was found miles and miles into one of the least explored sections of the catacombs. The video is largely uneventful until he starts following these arrows that he sees on the wall and that he sees on the ground. And these arrows bring him to these rooms that are completely full of human bones, which catacombs experts have no idea where they are. Like, they don't know where this is. Then out of nowhere, something spooks him and he starts sprinting deeper and deeper into the catacombs until he drops his camera. And then all you hear is his panic breathing and footsteps as he disappears. While nobody knows what actually happened to this guy, everybody seems to agree that the footage is authentic. This story has the best ending ever. In 2003, a 9-year-old was home alone playing video games when he thinks he hears his cat meowing on the back patio, so he goes downstairs to let him in. He sees a deranged-looking man standing on his back patio howling at the sky, who then quickly looks at the boy. He grabs a fistful of cigarette butts from the ashtray, stuffs them in his mouth before he starts howling at the sky some more. After the police take the man away, they come back to talk to the boy and his family. Turns out the man had severe autism and lived in that boy's house up until his mother passed away, at which time he was transitioned to a mental institution. He broke out of that mental institution to go looking for his mom, which is how he came back to the boy's house. 15 years later, that same boy is sitting on his same back patio when he starts to hear that same meowing sound, and he looks up and it's the same autistic man walking towards his house. Knowing the man's story, he invites him into his house. The man's face lights up, he runs inside and starts crying. He was finally home. The men become friends, and every week Tom goes home to visit. This is why you should always lock your crawl space. In 2019, a young woman had just moved into the second floor of an apartment building. She noticed a tiny crawl space that connected all the apartments on the floor, but she wrote it off, citing, "Who'd be small enough to crawl through that?" One night, she walks into her living room and out on the fire escape is a tiny woman desperately trying to yank open her locked windows. Terrified, she hides behind some furniture until the woman eventually leaves, at which point she runs into a room, grabs her phone, and calls the police. While waiting for the cops to arrive, she hears something above her and she looks up. One of the ceiling tiles had popped up and the woman from the fire escape is staring down at her. She'd used the crawl space to get up there. The girl screams and the woman scurries away. It took 3 days for the police to finally get the woman out of the crawl space and bring her into custody. Turns out she was on some unknown, extremely hard drug and had totally lost her mind. As you listen to this crazy story, think about how you would handle this. In the spring of 2003, a highly skilled mountaineer set off for a 1-day hike in a Utah canyon. He didn't tell anybody where he was going. As he was descending a narrow portion of the canyon, a boulder came dislodged and landed on his right arm and hand, pinning him there. Initially, he tried everything he could to get his hand free, but he couldn't do it. He even considered amputating, but his knife couldn't cut through the bone. After 5 days, he was out of water and he knew that he was about to die. So he took out his camera and recorded goodbyes to his family before falling asleep, believing he would never wake up again. When he woke up the next morning and hadn't died, he suddenly felt totally motivated to live. And so he did the unthinkable. He managed to break his arm using torque and then cut through the break in his arm with his dull pocket knife. It took him almost 2 hours to do this. After the amputation, he was able to rappel down and get the help that he needed. Aaron Ralston is quoted as saying, "I did not lose my arm, I gained back my life." This girl literally lived a nightmare. A 17-year-old girl was watching TV late at night when her motion detector lights in her driveway suddenly went on. She assumed it was just an animal, so she got up, drew the blinds, and went back to watching TV. Then a little bit later, it happened again. Before she could even react, she looks over and clearly makes out a silhouette of a person right behind the blinds who starts banging aggressively on the window. The girl stands up and goes, "I'm gonna call the cops!" And the figure stops for just a second, sprints to the side door and starts pounding even louder on that, screaming incoherently. The girl runs to the bathroom, barricades herself inside while she waits for the police, and then her worst nightmares come true. She hears glass shatter in the other room. After a few minutes of silence, she opens her door just a crack to get a peek outside, and standing in her living room next to a broken window is some crazy old woman who looks over at her and starts sprinting toward her. The lady comes smashing into the door and starts wailing on it until the police arrive and take her away. She was a lunatic who had escaped her facility. If you scare easily, I wouldn't watch this video. In 2013, a mine explorer found this entrance to an abandoned mine and decided to go have a look around. He decides to film his experience and upload it to his YouTube channel, where he had uploaded hundreds of other videos of him exploring mines, but he never once references the paranormal or ghosts or anything like that until this video. As soon as he steps foot inside, he tells the camera that he has a really uneasy feeling about being there and wonders if he should even keep going, but he does. Everything seems pretty normal until he gets to a section in the mine where there's a bunch of chains hanging down from the ceiling. He hears something in the back of the tunnel, so he pulls his flashlight out and he shines it towards the back, and he sees a chain swinging, and it shouldn't be, because there's no draft and he's all alone, and you can tell he's scared by the way he starts talking. Although he's totally freaked out, he wants to know what's causing the chain to swing, so he goes farther and farther into the mine until he hears something. People whispering in every direction. He gets totally spooked and runs out. If you don't want to sleep tonight, watch the whole video. If you're alone right now, don't watch this video. In the winter of 2018, a man who was living alone in the mountains wakes up to find a red ball sitting on his front yard. He assumed the only neighbor he had must have kids, and so he kicks the ball over the fence, goes inside, doesn't think anything of it. That night, he wakes up to the sound of kids laughing outside of his window. He goes outside to check on them because it's the middle of the night, and there's no kids anywhere, but that red ball is back on his property. So he picks it up, brings it in his house, and goes back to bed. The next morning, he goes over to his neighbor's house to let them know that their kids were out in his yard in the middle of the night. But it turns out his neighbor is just some old man who lives alone, and there aren't any kids anywhere in the area. That night, he wakes up again to the sound of kids on his property, and when he looks outside, there's no kids, but that red ball is back on his property. Panicked, he runs downstairs to make sure the one he brought in is still inside, and it's gone. He checked every window and door, and everything was still locked. It didn't make any sense. He decides to look out the window one more time, and off in the distance is some weird, stiff figure watching him. Whether you believe this video is real or not, it is undeniably scary. In 2003, guests at a hotel started calling the front desk about a screaming woman on the second floor, so the security guard went to go have a look. As he's making his way upstairs, the dispatcher tells him it's room 209, and no one's checked into that room. When he gets outside room 209, he hears it too. Take a listen. The security guard is visibly shaken, but finally musters the courage to go into the room to investigate, only to come out seconds later with a terrifying report.
John wants you to call the police right now if you don't mind. He says no one's in there, but that all of the furniture's been turned upside down.
No one knows what happened in room 209, and despite numerous investigations, no one's debunked this footage. Over the years, the hotel has had dozens of noise complaints from that room. I can confirm that this is a true story. In 2004, a 16-year-old boy who was staying with a friend in their cabin up in New Hampshire was having a hard time falling asleep. Around 3 a.m., he was still awake, and he remembers thinking how eerily quiet and totally pitch black the house was. And that's when he heard it. The front door opens and someone comes inside and begins walking through the house down the hallway right outside of his door where it stops. The door opens and the boy is instantly petrified because in walks this tall, shadowy figure that marches to the center of the room and then bows onto the ground and disappears. The boy stays up all night, terrified that this thing's gonna re-emerge and just look at him. Finally, he hears his friend's mom making coffee in the kitchen, so he runs out to tell her what happened. The whole time he's explaining what happened, she's just looking at him with sympathy in her eyes. And finally she says, "My husband visited me last night too." Her husband was dead, and I was that 16-year-old boy. This is why you should never explore the forest at night. Late at night in 2006, two men hear some strange noises coming from a forest near their house, so they decide to go have a look. After their footage went completely viral, they would admit that they actually only went into the woods just to scare themselves. They didn't actually expect to film anything. At some point on their walk, they start to notice more and more dead birds on the ground, and so one of them gets out his camera to start filming them. As they're filming the birds, you can tell that they're getting more and more spooked by the whole situation, and then one of the men hears something in the tree line, and the cameraman pans his camera to look. Human eyes don't reflect light. It's what she finds in the kitchen that's really scary. In the early 90s, a young girl was sleeping in her mom's bed when she suddenly woke up for no reason. She looked at her door and she saw her very affectionate cat kind of meowing down the hall as if someone was coming up to pet it, but she was next to her mom and they were the only ones in the house. The girl shakes her mom awake and points to the cat just as a man is walking past the door and disappears into the room across the hall. Before the man could come back out and find them, they both jump out the window, run across the street, and call the police. When the police arrive, the guy is nowhere to be found, but they do discover that the front door was unlocked, so that had to be the way he got in and out. But the mother swears up and down that she locked that door before she went to bed. A week later, the mother's cleaning their kitchen and she opens up the water heater closet where she finds this notebook that inside is their names and pictures of them in it, along with a pair of surgical gloves. Which means someone had snuck in at some point, was living in that closet spying on them, and then walking around their house at night. If you scare easily, this is not the video for you. In 2001, 4 teens decide to explore an abandoned mansion that locals believed a satanic cult was using to perform sadistic rituals. They go in through a basement window and find a piece of raw meat sitting on the ground with stones around it. It creeps them out, but they keep going. They make it to the first floor, but it's so hot up there they think something's on fire and they run away. The next night, they're feeling brave and decide to go back to the mansion and explore the top floors. They were not ready for what they find.
Cover my bag, alright. What the hell's that? That on the floor. Right there.
Experts believe that the teens stumbled across a satanic cult performing a ritual. You're about to listen to one of the creepiest recordings on the internet. In 2013, a woman who lived alone kept waking up to these loud clicking sounds in her bedroom, so she went out and got an audio recorder and started recording her sleep. For the first month, she doesn't pick up anything other than normal sleeping sounds. And then one morning she gets up and listens to it and she hears herself sleep talking and someone talks back.
What are you doing?
After she uploaded it to the internet, experts confirmed that it was authentic and that she could not have made that voice. You're about to watch one of the creepiest videos on the internet. In 2015, 2 men were driving at night when they spot what looked like a hunched over person in the middle of the road way off in the distance. As they got closer, they started hearing shrieking sounds in the woods all around them, and then they lost sight of the hunched over person. Feeling totally spooked, the guy in the passenger seat starts filming. Despite numerous attempts, this video has never been debunked. This is easily the scariest story I've ever heard. Where is it? I heard the door open. I heard the bells. I heard the pot. I heard the footsteps. I saw the door open. I see the thing walk in. I watched it walk down the aisle. I watched it bend over. It's in the room. Where is it? And this is night 1. There's 2 more nights of this, and it gets worse. The full episode is on my YouTube channel. Go check it out. There's a link in my bio on TikTok. And please subscribe because I'm going to be doing long episodes every week. Enjoy. The more you think about how this true story ends, the creepier it gets. In 2015, a college student was renting the basement apartment of his friend's house. One weekend, his basement roommates take off for the night, so he decides to use that time to get some homework done distraction-free. But as soon as he sits down to do his work, his friend upstairs and his family starts making all this noise, moving furniture around, shuffling feet. It's impossible to focus, so he picks up his phone and he texts his friend. "You guys sound like you're really having a good time up there. I'm not really getting anything done. Can I come up?" And his buddy says, "No one is home. We went to Wisconsin for the weekend." Terrified, he runs out the side door to get a look in the window to see who's making all the noise. All the lights are off in the house. There's not a single car in the driveway. He had been home alone the whole time. This is why you should always take your lockdown drills seriously. In 2017, two 16-year-olds were in their school bathroom when the lights suddenly went out and their school went into lockdown. Feeling rebellious, they decide, you know what, let's go explore the school a little bit first, and then we'll go follow procedure. They step out of the bathroom and look down the hall towards their classroom, and they see this large figure standing in front of their classrooms. It's definitely not a student, it's not a teacher. He's got ragged clothes on, and he starts walking towards them. They dart right back into the bathroom to the corner stall where they hide, praying that that man didn't see them. The man bursts in and starts yanking open all the stalls. Not wanting to see what happens when he gets to their stall, they get on the ground and start crawling to the side of the room where they finally get up and make a run for the door. They look back and he's holding a gun. The boys manage to get away safely and no one's hurt, but the police never capture the ragged man. Sometimes monsters are real. After his parents fell asleep at night, a 9-year-old would sneak downstairs into the kitchen and crush junk food. One night, as he's making his way downstairs, he swears he can hear someone in the kitchen, but his whole family's upstairs asleep. He peeks his head around the corner, and in the kitchen is this skinny man drinking milk straight from the carton with his back turned. The boy's terrified, sprints upstairs, tells his parents, who come right downstairs, they can't find anything. It looks like no one's been in the kitchen. And they ultimately blame their son, and they say, your imagination's just playing tricks on you. The kid knows what he saw, and for the next few days, he felt like everywhere he went in the house, he was being watched. Then one night, he's laying in bed looking at the vent on his ceiling, and he sees a pair of eyes looking down at him. Freaks out, runs to his parents, who come in, look everywhere, find nothing, and blame him again. A couple of weeks go by, and the boy starts to notice a terrible smell coming out of the vent on his ceiling. He convinces his parents to come in and actually cut into the ceiling and go look around, and they find that skinny man, and he's dead. This is why you should be very careful who you talk to online. A 16-year-old girl was home with her mom when she got a disturbing text message from a boy she had recently met on Snapchat. He told her he was right outside of her house, but when she went to look, no one was there. Frightened, she decides to sleep in her mom's room that night, and right before she goes to bed, she gets another text from the boy that just says, "I'm in your house." She shows her mom, who immediately searches the whole house, checks every door, turns on every light. There's no one there. So even though they're creeped out, they go back to bed. The next morning, she gets up and she goes back to her bedroom and immediately feels like she's being watched. She checks in her closet, looks behind her door, there's no one there. Then she noticed that the shoe boxes she normally kept perfectly arranged next to her bed had been moved. So she crouches down to put them back in order, and then out of the corner of her eyes, she notices something. The boy who was texting her was under her bed. The best things in life are usually a surprise. 9 years ago, my wife and I were asked to adopt a lanky orange kitten with special needs. Although we felt nervous about the challenge, we ultimately agreed to adopt Special Ed. At first, caring for Eddie was totally overwhelming. He had so much energy, but he could barely walk, and so he'd be bouncing off the walls, literally. And so we started to worry about his health. But ultimately, we figured out a solution: pillows, blankets, and baby gates. Over the following 9 years, we moved 6 times, including across the country. We had 2 kids. We added 2 more cats, and through it all, Eddie was there. Then last month, we brought Eddie in for a routine checkup at the vet. And old Eddie was just fine. And in fact, today is Eddie's 9th birthday, and we're so thankful we still have this guy, and I'm so thankful for the 3 million of you guys that are following me. That's insane. So thank you very much. Eddie, say thank you. He says thank you. We love you guys. Take care. Believe it or not, this is a well-documented true story. In 1947, an American ship picked up a horrifying distress signal coming from an unidentified vessel. The first transmission was all officers, including the captain, are dead. The next transmission was the whole crew is dead. The last transmission was I die, and then silence. The Americans trace the signal back to a ship that's drifting off in the middle of the Indian Ocean. They quickly assemble a rescue team who boards the ship. They find the entire crew has perished in the exact same position. They are on their backs with their hands up as if fighting with some unseen force, and they look like this. There was no physical damage to the bodies or to the ship itself. However, even though it was 100 degrees outside, it was 40 degrees on the ship, and the bodies were rapidly decomposing. As soon as they tie up the ship to tow it in, it explodes, and then it sinks. To this day, no one knows what happened inside of that ship. Some say it was a chemical leak, others aren't so sure. This is why you should always be afraid of strangers. In 2014, a disturbing text message conversation between two classmates was uploaded to the internet. Annie and David are talking casually, and then Annie hears footsteps outside and goes to look. She sees someone standing in her yard, and she assumes it's just Dave playing a joke on her, but it's not. Suddenly, the stranger starts sprinting towards her house. He smashes through a window, and now he's in her house. She freaks out, jumps in a closet, and tells Dave to call the police. She tells Dave that he's yelling for her to come out, and then Annie stops texting. When Annie finally writes back that everything's just fine, Dave realizes something. He wasn't talking to Annie anymore. You're about to hear one of the most disturbing true stories on the internet. In 1921, a German farmer woke up to find a deep set of footprints leading from the forest right up to his back door. Whoever had come to his house had not left yet. After making sure it wasn't just his family, he searched everywhere on his property and his house everywhere, and he could not determine who made the prints or where they went. A few weeks later, his maid abruptly quit, saying that every time she's alone in the house, she hears demonic voices in the attic. Shortly thereafter, he and his family start to hear the voices too. When no one's heard from them in a couple days, the neighbors go over to check and they find them in the barn. One by one, each of the family members made their way down to the barn where they were systematically murdered and stacked in the corner. To this day, no one knows who or what is responsible for this crime. This sounds totally made up until you listen to the police report. In the early 90s, a teenage girl started to see these shadowy figures that would come into a room at night and crawl all around her room and even grab at her legs. At the same time, her health began to rapidly deteriorate, which ultimately led to her death, which doctors never understood. A few days after her death, her sister woke up to a whistling sound and saw a creature crawling around her room with no face. The same night, her mom was ripped out of bed by someone. The father calls the police, who come over, they search the house, they don't find anything, it's all quiet. As they're about to leave, they hear something. Horrifying screams coming out of the bedroom. They run inside, no one's in there, but there are these huge gashes on the wall that were not there before. The police get out of there. In the police report that was filed immediately after this house call, the chief inspector and the 3 officers that were there that night swear they saw and heard the same things as the family, which means the police officially believed that the house was haunted. This is why you should never take walks alone at night. In 2007, a girl was on a late night walk when she looked at the end of the road and saw the silhouette of a man moving around very strangely. It was like he was doing the waltz, but he was moving towards her, so she was sketched out, crossed the road, and went the other way. After a couple minutes, she turned around to see what he was doing, and he was right across the street from her, now staring up into the sky with a huge grin on his face. Now totally creeped out, she turns around and walks about a half block before checking again, and to her horror, he's now crouched down right behind her. But luckily, he stands up, turns around, and kind of hobbles away, and then she notices something. The man had turned around and was now sprinting directly towards her. She runs to safety and now just hopes she never has to see that smiling man again. This true story is so simple and so creepy. On June 21st, 2009, a 16-year-old wakes up to an empty house around 11 a.m. He heads downstairs, grabs a snack, and goes to the basement and plans on watching TV for the next few hours until he meets his friend around 3. About 30 minutes later, his mom comes downstairs and asks him, "Where have you been all day?" Confused, he says, "I've only been up for like 30 minutes. And then he looks at his phone, and it's after 7 o'clock at night. There's dozens of missed calls and several text messages from his friend and his mom asking, "Where are you?" He tells his mom that none of this makes any sense, but what she tells him is even worse. She said that she was there all day and saw him go into the basement at 11, but after that, he was gone all day. So for one day in the summer of 2009, this kid didn't exist.